All right, so today we're going to look at toxicology and LD50, which is lethal dose 50%. We'll talk about what that means. But toxicology is a study of how harmful a substance is to the human body, and that depends on several things. The first is the dosage of the substance, so the amount that you have ingested, that you've inhaled, or that has been absorbed into your skin, and all of that is at one time, not over time. We've talked about the two terms bioaccumulation and biomagnification. If a substance bioaccumulates, meaning it's stored in your organs, tissues, or fat cells, then that may lead to more harm over time. And then biomagnification, depending on what you eat, especially some fish, those substances that bioaccumulate can magnify through the food web. And so as you eat foods that are at those higher trophic levels, you are consuming higher concentrations or higher dosages of those substances. And we talked about DDT, PCBs, as well as other substances. Also, there's chemical reactions. So if you ingest or inhale more than one substance at a time, they can have an interaction that can either decrease or multiply those effects. All right, when you do consume two or more substances at one time, if they have an antagonistic interaction, they reduce the harmful response. So a lot of times when we take medicines, we take them in combination or even with vitamins. So for example, if you take vitamin A and E, they interact together in your body to reduce your body's response to carcinogens. So that would be an antagonistic interaction. A synergistic interaction multiplies those harmful effects. For example, if you work in a field where you have inhaled asbestos, that increases your chance of lung cancer. But if you are a smoker who has also inhaled asbestos, that doesn't mean you have twice the chance. It actually means you have 400 times the chance of developing lung cancer. So that would be a synergistic interaction because it's multiplied the harmful effects. All right, so a poison is something that is classified as having an LD50 of 50 milligrams or less per kilogram of body weight. Now that sentence probably means absolutely nothing to you right now. But as we go through and talk about LD50, the lower the dosage, the more poisonous or toxic it is. So what LD50 stands for, it stands for lethal dose of 50%. So it's the amount of chemical in one dose that kills 50% of the animals in the test population, usually within a 14-day period. A lot of times we use mice and rats to test because the way their bodies metabolize toxins is very similar to how human bodies do. So we can estimate what the lethal dose would be for human as well. So the graph that you see here is called a dose response curve. And you can see, we can determine what that dosage is at where 50% of our test animal does not survive. Now, what that means, that lethal dose, it doesn't mean that if you consume that amount, you're going to die. It means you probably have a 50% chance of having a lethal reaction. All right, so these dose response curves show the effects of various dosage of a toxic agent on our test organism. So I'll go back to that graph in just a second, but on the x-axis is the concentration of the toxin, y-axis is the response, and it's usually that S-shaped curve. All right, epidemiology is the study of patterns of disease or other harmful effects from toxic exposure within defined groups of people to figure out why some people get sick and others do not. So again, on this graph, it means that 50% have a chance of having a lethal reaction. So some their bodies may metabolize something differently than another. They might have a different response. So a lot of times we want to know why that is. We do the same thing with diseases. We want to know why are some people have such a reaction while others do not. All right, so looking at types of hazards. So we've been talking about poisons. A toxic chemical is something that is fatal to more than half of the test animals, so that LD50 at given concentration. Something that is hazardous just causes harm. So it might be flammable, irritating, or damaging to your skin or lungs. It can interfere with oxygen uptake or cause allergic reactions. So it doesn't necessarily kill you. It just has some type of reaction. So types of chemical hazards. The first category are mutagens. These are things that cause mutations to DNA molecules. Now that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to affect the parent, but those mutations to DNA molecules can get passed on to the children. Most mutations, however, are harmless because your body has repair mechanisms to repair the DNA. A teratogen is something that causes birth defects. It can be chemicals, radiation, viruses. So this is something that the mother is exposed to while she is pregnant. So some examples: PCBs, thalidomide, can't even say that word, thalidomide, steroid hormones, arsenic, cadmium, there's many others. A carcinogen is something that causes cancer. Again, it could be a chemical, it can be exposure to radiation, or even some viruses that can promote the growth of malignant tumors. All right, so there are several different effects that chemical hazards can have. If it affects your immune system, then that affects how your body responds to viruses, bacteria, diseases. So there's HIV, certain types of radiation, malnutrition can affect your immune system. Neurotoxins are what affects the nervous system. There's some examples there. Your nervous system, the one that we've talked about in class is mercury, with mercury poisoning from the fish, especially in Minamata Bay of Japan. The reaction that we were seeing was people were having seizures or couldn't control their muscles because the mercury was affecting their nervous system. Endocrine system, there are synthetic chemicals like endocrine disruptors that can affect how your body produces hormones. Biological hazards, one category of those are non-transmissible diseases, so things that you cannot spread from person to person, like you can't spread cardiovascular disease. If I have a heart attack, I can't pass that along to you. Same thing with cancer, diabetes, etc. A transmissible disease is something caused by a living thing and can be spread from person to person. So that could be through like an insect vector, virus, bacteria. Pathogens are spread various ways, through the air, like if you cough, through the water, food, body fluids, insect vectors. The World Health Organization's 7 deadliest infectious diseases: any acute respiratory infection, so that would be pneumonia, flu, any coronavirus, anything that leads to those respiratory infections that often get worse and affect either the really old or the really young. HIV and AIDS, diarrheal diseases, that one may come as a surprise, but a lot of people suffer from diarrheal diseases when they don't get the proper hydration. Tuberculosis, malaria, measles, hepatitis B. So those are going to be the 7 deadliest infectious diseases. All right, so treatments for these diseases: if it's a bacterial or protozoan, we can treat it with antibiotics. Viral disorders, there's not much we can do after the fact, but they can be prevented by vaccines before infection. Things that affect the spread of transmissible diseases. We have more increased international air travel, more migration to urban areas, so you have higher concentrated numbers of people. And you can read through hunger, malnutrition, things that breed mosquitoes, global warming, winds, when wind is a vector, accidental introduction of insect vectors, flooding that can breed mosquitoes. Another thing that we see, epidemiological transition. The things that affect children are not the same that affect adults, not the same that affect older people. So, and we also see this with developing versus developed countries. So infectious and parasitic diseases tend to cause more of the deaths in developing countries, but only 1% in developed. I think I might have said that backwards. But if you look at the graph there, over time, when you're older, you're more likely to die from something that is chronic. When you're younger, you're more likely to die from like a disease or acute illness. Okay. And that's it for LD50. On the webpage, you'll see some practice with how to determine LD50, and there's a practice free response question that includes how to graph LD50. We tend to use log graph paper, which may not be something that you are used to, so I would suggest that you look at that free response question. I also attached the answers to that as well, so after you work through it, you can check and see how you did.